Please welcome world-renowned historian Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. I am so glad to welcome everyone to Simon & Schuster's Centennial celebration. And what stagecraft the planners have fashioned for us on this day of commemoration. They somehow managed to get the heavens above to mark the occasion by providing a total solar eclipse this afternoon. So they've set a spectacular tone for our grand family reunion tonight. Here on Earth, down below the heavens, it has been so much fun for me to absorb the storied history of the Simon & Schuster family, to learn of the unlikely genesis that sprang from two young Columbia University graduates, Richard Simon, a piano salesman, and Max Schuster, an arts and culture columnist. The two friends were united by a dream to establish a publishing house that would sell better books to more people at lower prices. No books, they pledged, would bear their name that they had not read, and they were not proud to stand behind. When they opened their doors on 57th Street on January 3rd, 1924, however, they had only one employee, a stenographer, and only one book on their spring list, a book of crossword puzzles. Now, crosswords in newspapers were all the rage at the time, and this was the first book to put together a series of puzzles. They had a first printing of 3,600 copies, $1.25 for each copy, and it included an eraser-capped pencil. But shortly before publication, Richard and Max began to have cold feet, fearful that their first offspring might make it seem that they were publishers of activity books and make it difficult for them to attract novels, poetry, and serious works of nonfiction. So they decided to hide the puzzle book under the name of Plaza Publishers in honor of the Plaza Hotel, where they had routinely met week after week to plan this big adventure. But then when the crossword book became a colossal bestseller, selling 100,000 copies in the first few weeks, Richard and Max decided the time had come to acknowledge their illegitimate offspring in an article in Publishers Weekly. The mysterious Plaza Books, they now proudly revealed, was a wholly owned subsidiary of Simon & Schuster. And in that same issue, our enterprising founders announced their first fall list, including 2 novels, 1 biography, 1 book of poetry, and 4 more puzzle books. By the end of 1924, the 5 crossword books had sold 1 million copies, and Richard Simon and Max Schuster were off and running. At which point, Max Schuster, who had admired Abraham Lincoln ever since high school, decided to adopt Lincoln as his middle name and would forever after sign his name M. Lincoln Schuster. So what better threesome could we have as our founding fathers, Richard Simon, Max Schuster, and their silent partner, Abraham Lincoln? It is a mark of how old I am that S&S has been my publishing home for nearly 1/2 of its 100-year history. And oh, wow. And over these nearly 5 decades, S&S never once lost faith in me as I took an inordinate amount of time to complete each book, twice as long to write about the Civil War and Lincoln's team of rivals as it took the war to be fought, longer than World War II to write about Franklin and Eleanor and the home front. And for these last years, S&S has been at my side on the emotional journey that resulted in the book that will be published next week, An Unfinished Love Story, A Personal History of the 1960s. The idea for the book, oh yeah, you're so great, thank you. The idea for the book sprang one summer morning, several months after my late husband, Dick Goodwin, had turned 80. He came down the stairs, clumps of shaving cream on his ears, singing, "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning" from the musical Oklahoma. When I asked why he was so chipper, he announced that he had finally decided to open some 300 boxes he had dragged with us through our entire married life, boxes that contained diaries, letters, drafts of historic speeches, memos, and memorabilia from the 1960s, a decade when he seemed to be a Zelig-like figure, present at defining moments with all the major characters, with JFK, Jackie Kennedy, LBJ, Martin Luther King, Eugene McCarthy, and Robert Kennedy. For 40 years, however, Dick had been leery of opening these boxes. The ending of the decade, the escalating war in Vietnam, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, riots in the cities, violence on college campuses, had cast a dark curtain on the entire era for him and for the entire country. Dick wanted only to look ahead. But then at 80, he had finally realized, he told me, if he had any wisdom to dispense, he better start dispensing soon. So we resolved to go through the boxes together in chronological order, reliving the 60s week by week, year by year, suspending knowledge of the end of the story, knowing only what the people at the time knew. Thus began our last great adventure together. In the middle of our project, Dick was diagnosed with a cancer that eventually took his life. Throughout his illness, however, the prospect of the book kept him anchored. It gave him a sense of purpose. I realize now we were both in the grip of a fantasy, maintaining the enchanted thought that so long as we were working on the project, learning, laughing, exploring the boxes, his life, my life, our lives together would not be finished. If a talisman is an object thought to have a magical power and to bring luck, the book was our talisman. I've often called the subjects of my books, Abraham Lincoln, both Roosevelt's and LBJ, my guys, because I've spent so many decades immersing myself in their letters, diaries, and memoirs, waking up with them in the morning, thinking about them when I go to bed at night. I would often talk with them. I would continually ask them questions, but sadly, they never once answered. But now, my guy is my husband, sitting across the room from me, arguing with me, correcting me, laughing, as we read aloud from his letters, diaries, and documents. When Dick died, I felt the weight and the responsibility of the project we had begun together. In the months of grief and dislocation that followed, it was always on my mind. It began to evolve from a memoir I was helping him to write to a joint memoir as I explored my own experiences in the 60s, and then to something larger as I reached out to interview and hear stories from a chorus of voices that had witnessed and helped shape a generation. The importance of telling stories from previous generations was the core of an address Abraham Lincoln delivered when he was 28 years old. He was troubled by the temper of the country in the 1830s, a tendency to substitute passion for judgment, to engage in mob action in disregard of the laws of the land. In such unsettled times, he cautioned, a dictator might arise. He worried that with the passage of some 60 years since the American Revolution and the ratification of the Constitution, the living history of that time, the vivid and visceral experiences once found in every family, was fading, along with the founding generation itself. To restore that state of communal feeling so essential to democracy, the stories of the revolution and the founding of our nation, he said, must be told and retold, read and recounted. Lincoln's words took on a powerful resonance in my mind as I realized that in a similar way, some 60 years after memories of the upheavals of the 60s have begun to fade, be half forgotten or become misunderstood, my project with Dick might add our voices, along with a chorus of firsthand participants and witnesses, to the task of restoring a living history of that pivotal decade, allowing us to see what opportunities were seized, what mistakes were made, and what light might be cast on our own fractured time. More and more I realized that memories of violence and riots that set whole cities ablaze had obscured the greatest illumination of the 60s, the exhilarating conviction that individuals could make a difference, the impulse that stirred tens of thousands of young people to join the Peace Corps, to participate in sit-ins and freedom rides, to march and demonstrate against segregation and the denial of the vote, and to launch the women's movement and the gay rights movement for freedom, equality, and justice. And when the conscience of the country was fired, long-established systems of discrimination began to tumble. Oh, how we need a return of that fighting spirit today. But as I come to an end, let me return for a moment to where I began, to young Richard Simon and Max Schuster, and the choice they made at the birth of Simon and Schuster to adopt as their logo the figure of a man spreading seeds from a painting by Jean-Francois Millet. This original emblem of the seed sower was a metaphor for the enduring power of books to plant seeds of inspiration, imagination, courage, humor, entertainment, empathy, and resilience, and yes, a reverence for facts, a reverence for truth, and a reverence for knowledge, the very qualities of mind and spirit we so badly need to begin the process of healing our beleaguered country today. So in that spirit, let our celebration begin.